How are we doing, everybody? Good morning. Making sure we're alive. There we go. Well, hello. Here we are. What day is it, boys? Tuesday. Tuesday. I wanted to talk this morning about choosing wisdom with a little historical context. This is not the first kind of crisis that the world has faced at large. This is not the first kind of crisis that Christians have had to wrestle with their faith. But it is the first time for us. It's the first time our generation, and maybe even our parents, and depending on the age of your grandparents, generation have had to face something of this magnitude and scope and global impact and political ramification and how our faith gets played out in that context. So the first thing I want to remind you is that none of us have been here before. None of us probably have experience quite like this, knowing exactly what to do. So we need to offer a measure of kindness and grace to ourselves and to those around us and to those leading us. Next point I would make is that the Second World War is a helpful example that I've been thinking through in a bunch of different ways regarding this situation. So the Second World War lasted 4 or 5 years, global conflict, but no one knew at the beginning the horrors of the Holocaust that were taking place. At least in the West, generally speaking, no one had any idea about the systematic extermination of the Jews that was being undertaken in Nazi Germany. And it's easy with our perspective looking back today to see that. But it's important to understand that at the outset of the war, it was just a seemingly geopolitical conflict between, to do with Germany. And then gradually more and more countries got involved. But it was the major moral imperative that came in response to the wholesale systematic slaughter of 6 million of one particular ethnic group, plus people with disabilities, Jehovah's Witnesses, all kinds of other groups were attacked. That moral imperative wasn't present until after really the war was over and they began to discover the death camps and the extermination camps and to see the extent of the evil that had been done. So you roll the clock back, and at the outset of the war, tons of people didn't think Hitler was a crazy psycho. You had many political leaders, religious leaders, who just thought, well, he's leading his country in a good direction. He's got a strong fist, and Germany certainly had been taken advantage of after the First World War, and it's time that a strong national leader emerged. And you had all this kind of dialogue going on. And it took a long time before people really fully began to realize the scope of what was taking place and the tyranny of Hitler in particular and of the other leaders. And so, again, I say that not to let anybody off the hook, but to remind us that we're only 4 weeks into this, really. I mean, for some people, obviously, for China and for many Asian nations, they've been involved in this for longer, but for the many of us who are kind of in this like self-isolation thing now in the Western world, this is only 4 or 5 weeks in. And we don't know what we're going to know 6 months from now, or a year from now, 18 months from now. We don't know what we're going to know then. And so we have to, I think it behooves us to once again have a measure of grace for ourselves and for our leaders, some of whom come on faster and some of whom come on slower. Boris Johnson in the UK has been criticized heavily for his initial response. Then he began leading, it seems, in a much more proactive way, and now he's personally sick and is in intensive care in the hospital. That's a situation where that nation needs prayer. No nation, regardless of your political persuasion, will be well served by their political leader dying of this particular virus. The logistical, political, emotional cost of that is not worth bearing. So, which kind of leads us into prayer, because, again, also, historical context, we have a lot of Christian leaders, especially in the charismatic space where I tend to have one foot at least, talking about faith, using scripture to basically say, like, that pestilence will never come near you, Christians will be kept safe, have faith, trust in God that you won't get sick. And I value the kind of faith that believes God at his word and believes what is meant to be the divine life of those embracing God. But this is not the first plague or pestilence that has been visited upon the world since the time of Christ. And Christians have died in plagues and pestilences over the last 2,000 years. Christians have died in wartime. Christians holding those promises from Scripture have died. Plagues and pestilences have come near them and they have died. It's like martyrdom and persecution of the church. Those of us who don't experience persecution, I think, often have this rosy view. The persecution really strengthens the church. And, the early church was not the state-sponsored church, and there was a real strength that was born out of persecution. And there's a certain truth to that. But I think when you spend time with those who live within the persecuted church, often you hear a different perspective. I spoke to I had a guy on the podcast who, Pastor Andrew Brunson, who'd spent 2 years in prison in Turkey. And he said, sometimes persecution kills the church and the church is just wiped out. And that's not good. So I think we need to have a measure of historical perspective as we come into the next 4 weeks of whatever this looks like, as we come in to celebrate Easter, as we celebrate Easter in a situation that is really painful for us. There's a beautiful invitation there to enter into the historical context of suffering with generations of believers who have celebrated Easter in pain, who have celebrated Easter while mourning, for whom the lament aspects of Easter have been very, very meaningful. Maybe I'll talk more about that as we get closer to next weekend, to this coming weekend. But I just want to say, look, Christians have died in plagues and pestilences before. So when we hold on to those scriptures, let's not ignore the last 2,000 years of Christian history, of world history. Let's not jump straight from Revelation to 2020. Let's understand that we should be wise, that we should be careful, that we should take precautions, that doesn't mean we're not being faith-filled. That sometimes the place of faith is, God, I'm going to obey the leaders around me. I'm going to do the loving thing for my neighbors and isolate myself. I'm going to trust and have faith that God will provide for me financially. I'm going to trust and have faith that God is at work even when I can't see him at work. I'm going to trust and have faith that those I can't see will be kept healthy. I'm going to trust and have faith that even though my church and faith community can't meet together, I'm going to believe that we are still one, that we are still one body. I'm going to trust and have faith that these Christians all around the world are one body. I'm going to trust and have faith that good will come out of this, even though I can't see it. There's plenty of room for faith without a kind of maybe ignorance to historical realities of suffering. I'm going to have faith that even if I admit to my own fear, and allow my emotions to speak, that they will not be the only voice speaking. I'm going to have faith that God welcomes my emotions and my fears and treats them with honor and dignity. I was talking with a friend yesterday, and he pointed out in this story of Gideon, God is endlessly patient with Gideon. He turns up, finds Gideon threshing wheat in a wine press, right? Is that what it is? Or pressing wine in a I don't know. Either way, I don't remember. But he's hiding basically, and he's doing his work at night, so that the enemy who've invaded the land don't seize his grain, take his stuff away from him. And God's like, "Hey, brave guy, so you're going to lead my people." And Gideon's like, "Not me." And then eventually he lays out his fleece, and then the fleece is not enough, so he lays out a second fleece, and all this kind of stuff and God eventually is like sends his armies away, and he whittles them down to just 300 and says, "Now you've got what you need." And basically says, like, "I'll be with you, so no worries. But if you are still afraid, go up and check out the enemy's camp." God has so much room for our fear. He has so much grace and kindness for our limitations. So maybe that's a promise for you today, that your faith is allowed to include preparedness. It is allowed to include wisdom. It is allowed to include listening to the advice of your civic, municipal, provincial, state government leaders. It is allowed to include listening to your pastors and sometimes disagreeing with them, sometimes agreeing with them. It is allowed to include leaving room for God to work in the midst of everything. So, put your hand on your heart. Take a deep breath. Why don't you say over yourself, "I'm allowed to be afraid. I'm allowed to have faith. My faith is allowed to include fear. God honors my fears. God is kind to my limitations. I can be kind to my limitations too." So as you go about your day today, just remember that we don't know what we're going to know in 4 weeks' time. No, don't touch it. We don't know what we're going to know about this in a year's time. So you can move gently and graciously. Do the best you can. And you can't ask anything else of yourself. And no one else can ask anything else of you either. May you have grace and peace and hope today. We're going to get through this like those who've gotten through this in the past. Much love. Talk soon.